Hi, folks. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be invited, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to talk this morning about something that I think is so important for the future and stability of the world, and that I've come to care about, and that's the future of human migration. But to get there, to get us started, I'm going to start in the past, pretty far back in the past. And that's with the thought that moving, it turns out, is the ultimate form of climate adaptation. Somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens fled Africa because of drought, chasing the bounty of a green belt of vegetation northward. They made it as far as the Middle East, mixing for a few thousand years with the Neanderthals before extreme climate shifts drove Neanderthals to extinction. As the Ice Age lowered sea levels, the surviving humans then walked across exposed bridges of land, south across what are now the islands of Indonesia, perhaps sailing short distances to New Guinea before walking onward to Australia. It was only later, with the retreat of those glaciers exposing verdant northern latitudes, that people could settle on the European continent and beyond. And such has been the role of the environment in shaping where people live on the planet for all the ages since. 3,000 years ago, the Indus Valley emptied out because of drought. Some anthropologists believe that 1,100 years ago, Mayan civilization crumbled in the face of water shortages. 900 years ago, Chinese herders moved thousands of miles northward into the Russian tundra, seeking new pastures in the as the northern plains of Asia thawed. And ever since, humans have been driven across continents by ambition, by persecution, by aggression, curiosity, evangelism, but looming larger than perhaps anything else were the changes in their climate. So about 4 years ago, I guess 5 years ago, I set out on a project to understand how the changing climate today will again lead the population of the planet to reorganize, to migrate, to understand the far-reaching implications for stability and for society. I would travel throughout Central America, Mexico, the American South, reporting in rural regions and tagging along with the United Nations Food Program. We hired researchers who had first built migration models for the World Bank to build new models forecasting rates of human migration in response to climate change that were brand new, and then spent months focusing on internal disruption and migration just within the United States. Later, I'd write a book about that aspect, about the change I'm seeing for this country, and it's called On the Move. And the goal of all of this work was to build upon the academic research that existed and sharpen a more precise picture of what was to come. And the most important finding, and the obvious finding, is that future migration is different than what's happened in the past because the world is different. The transformation of the world's and planet's environment today is unlike anything in history. The environmental changes are more extreme and they're already unfolding more quickly. And at the same time, the number of people affected, the population of the planet, is vastly larger than at any previous point of change. This slide shows the average annual temperature compared to baseline from 1850 to 2010 to give a sense of how far off of historical normal we are. So consider, for example, that when the Mayans are thought to have succumbed to drought around 8,900, the planet's total population was just 226 million people. By the time scientists began warning in earnest of climate change in the mid-1970s, the world's population had swelled to 4 billion. Since then, the number of people has doubled again. It's more than 8 billion. By 2070, the world's population could be somewhere between 9 and 12 billion people, depending on how policies and economic development that affect population growth unfold. And all the while, even with the change already baked in, the Earth will continue to warm. The data and research suggests that as this happens, people will do what they have always done for thousands of years in response to their environment. They will move. So my first big questions then were how many people, when, and to where? It turns out there is an optimal climate zone for human life, a niche. For the past 6,000 years, humans have gravitated towards a narrow range of temperatures and precipitation levels that supported agriculture and later supported economic growth. But now, according to researchers who published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that niche is shifting towards the poles. Climate change is literally remapping where humans can exist on the planet. Only a small sliver of the Earth's surface, about 1%, was historically so hot that researchers described it as uninhabitable. But today, that sliver is fast expanding across some of the most crowded places on the planet. By 2070, some 19% of the planet will be too hot to traditionally support human civilization. So already, due to the past several decades of warming, more than 600 million people have been stranded outside of the crucial environmental niche that best supports life. Should the world continue on its present warming trend, failing to meaningfully reduce carbon levels, we will miss the Paris targets of 1.5 degrees Celsius by a long shot. The planet will likely warm approximately 2.7 degrees, and that pathway could lead to 2 billion people falling outside of the climate niche within just the next 8 years, and 3.7 people doing so by 2090. That's a mid-range projection. Consider for a moment a worst-case projection. With 3.6 degrees of warming and a pessimistic climate scenario that includes ongoing fossil fuel use, resistance to international migration, and more rapid population growth, the shifting climate niche could pose what the authors of that study call a, quote, existential risk to civilization. It would directly affect half of the total population, or in this case, as many as 6.5 billion people. Either way, the total number of people left outside of the climate niche will have grown to between a third and a half of humanity by later this century, all facing extreme heat, food scarcity, higher death rates, unless emissions are sharply curtailed or mass migration is accommodated. Few of these impacts will land equally. Climate change will affect poorer parts of the world disproportionately, effectively sentencing the people who live in the developing nations and small island states to extreme temperatures and greater suffering first. At current rates of warming, the researchers estimate that more than 600 million Indians will be affected, the most of any nation. In Nigeria, more than 300 million citizens will be exposed. Indonesia could see 100 million people fall out of their secure and predictable environment. The Philippines, Pakistan, 80 million people, and so on. The US faces substantial but far more modest impacts. But even here, the South and Southwest will fall towards the hottest end of the niche, leading to higher mortality and driving internal migration northward. This is an image of how that shifting climate niche affects North America. Not everyone, of course, whose environment shifts, even outside of the niche, will move. These numbers that I'm giving are not exactly the number of people that are expected to migrate, but all of those people that are affected, they'll face a choice. They'll have to choose whether to remain or endure, remain and endure, or whether to move. Most of them won't go anywhere, or they'll shift small distances. But the sheer number of people affected suggests that if even a small fraction do, the change will be transformative. And this is how we get to what I think is next, a great human migration. In many parts of the world, this migration is already well underway. The pressures of climate on populations are already catalyzing local upheaval that's leading to insecurity, to food shortages, to political and armed conflict. In North Central Africa, caravans of famished refugees have evacuated from the drought-racked shores of Lake Chad. In Bangladesh, flooding coastal deltas have sent a crush of people, first to the slums in Dhaka and then onward to the Indian border. And in the United States, a quiet exodus away from the front lines of Western wildfires and Gulf Coast hurricanes is hollowing out small towns. These are the fires in Southern California a couple of years back. Perhaps no example is more telling than what's happened in Syria, where farmers whose animals died from drought migrated to Syria's cities, impoverished, and they joined uprisings against the government. So this was by no means a climate-exclusive event, but climate influenced it, and the resulting war led millions of those refugees to flee in rubber rafts to the shores of Turkey and Greece and ultimately to Europe. The climate shocks don't always have to be localized either. A bad wheat crop in Russia in 2011 interrupted the export of grain to North Africa, causing food shortages that, combined with high unemployment, stoked the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and Libya. Together with the war in Syria, these upheavals drove large waves of migrants into Europe in 2015, ultimately instigating the UK's exit from the European Union, causing plenty of political turmoil in Germany, Greece, and Italy too. As destabilizing as those waves of migration arguably were, though, they were relatively small. Combined, these conflicts brought just 2 million people to the continent of Europe. As you'll see with some of the numbers to come, we can expect that this is just the beginning, the first subtle signs of what I see as an epochal slow motion exodus of people out of inhospitable places. So where will we see that upheaval first? The World Bank and academic researchers at places, including Columbia University, have begun to identify hotspots around the world where they expect significant climate migration to emanate from in the future. One of those places where circumstances may be the most urgent is North Africa's Sahel. The 9 countries sandwiched between the Sahara and the humid savanna is probably the most at-risk place on the planet. For more than 150 million people live there, and nearly half of them depend on subsistence farming to survive. Yet the land is quickly turning to desert, its trees cut down for fuel and its soil eroding from overuse and poor management. The drought here is among the worst in Africa, and already more than 100,000 people have died as a result of water scarcity there over the past couple of decades. At the same time, the population in the Sahel is growing faster than almost anywhere else on the planet, stretching those scarce resources further. Each woman in the Sahel, on average, gives birth to 5 children. Across North Africa, the World Bank estimates there could be 350 additional people by 2050. The known water supplies will fall short for tens of millions of people. The World Bank's chief economist laid this bare for me in very frank terms. He said, quote, "It really stretches the imagination to see how this can work." The bank's researchers expect migration to follow the same progression for how people have moved in the most vulnerable parts of the world in the past. First, migration begins in rural areas, which are often poorest and dependent on fertile soil and abundant water. These pastoral lands will begin to empty out. Most people hope to remain as close as possible to home, even when they decide they must move. And so first, perhaps, they'll jump to mid-sized towns in search of work while remaining close to family. Then perhaps they'll move on to a capital city in what academics tend to call, quote, stepwise migration. The rural outmigration will drive a rapid urbanization that could quickly make cities dangerously overcrowded. The World Bank, for example, is sounding an alarm about the huge influx of people into East African megacities like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where climate stress and declining crop yields are driving people from across the countryside into the city. The population of Addis Ababa has doubled since 2000, and it's on track to double again by 2035. The bank predicts that as the climate worsens, some 57 million more North Africans will migrate within their own countries, searching for livable conditions. And it's a pattern that will be replicated in other continents too. But then what? Right now, a little more than half of the planet's population lives in urban areas. But by the middle of the century, the World Bank estimates that 67% will live in cities. Urbanization is a global phenomenon regardless of wealth, but it's the world's poorest people, the same people, continent by continent, whose ability to feed themselves is most affected by the climate crisis, who are the ones rushing out of rural areas fastest. In Africa, rural to urban migration, according to the World Economic Forum, is happening almost 11 times faster than it is in Europe. People move to these cities because they can seem like a refuge, but they can also easily become traps. Demand for water and electricity surges as the population grows, and food, which increasingly needs to be imported, becomes more expensive. The costs drive the poor into slums, and as unemployment and poverty rise, so does the risk of human trafficking and domestic abuse, and as sanitation deteriorates, so does the risk of disease increase. This is a graphic showing the outpouring from rural regions into cities in Central America and Mexico, and it was part of my reporting. So it's based on the modeled projections and the data that I used in my research. And what you see is the orange are areas of growth in urban areas, and the black are areas of declining population in rural regions. So what happens next as these cities urbanize is what nations around the world seek to avoid most. Criminal groups become a substitute for government. Slums become hotbeds for extremism and chaos, ultimately fomenting conflict that risks spilling outward and destabilizing whole regions. The recruiting and fundraising for Al Qaeda, for example, has been linked to hardships in agriculture and animal grazing. By 2030, the World Bank estimates that 4 out of every 10 urban residents, more than 2 billion people globally, will live in slums. And the International Committee of the Red Cross estimates that almost all of that growth, 96% of it, is expected in the world's most fragile cities, which already face heightened risks of conflict. As for Africa, this potential destabilization obviously sits adjacent to all of Europe. And the experts I spoke with fear that the continent's climate-related losses will feed what one of them called a quote, a constant outpouring of people. It may be a similar story in South Asia, which is home to roughly 2 billion people. Himalayan glaciers are disappearing. Meltwater from the Himalayas, the water tower of Asia, supports the lives of nearly 1 in 4 people on the planet. The greatest rivers, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, Salween, the Yellow River, all of them run from these high glaciated peaks down to some of the world's largest cities. Just south of the mountains, a band of irrigation-dependent agriculture stretches for hundreds of miles into the lowlands of India and Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, making it possible to grow food that feeds the entire continent. Temperatures here are skyrocketing, and the intensity and frequency of cyclones and flooding are increasing. And as the economies of the region have become increasingly unstable, some 8.5 million people have already fled this region. Tens of millions of more have begun shifting internally, moving away from those rural areas and into the biggest cities, into Delhi and Dhaka and Lahore and Karachi. The World Bank estimates that even under a relatively optimistic climate scenario, one in which global carbon emissions are brought under control, 17 million South Asians will be displaced due to increasing environmental stress. Under a bad case climate scenario, it projects 36 million people in this region might leave their homes. The bank didn't even count the effect of rising seas in those models, and climate scientists have recently said that they underestimated the number of people that they now think will be displaced by rising tides by a factor of 3. They now estimate globally that between 150 and 630 million people will be forced from their homes over the next 3 decades. This kind of change will inundate places from southern Iraq to eastern China to Alexandria, Egypt, and the 40 million people of the Nile River Delta to the southern tier of the United States. On the Mekong Delta, for instance, the livelihoods of about 20 million Laotians, Cambodians, Thais, and Vietnamese are in jeopardy as sea level rise threatens more than half of the land that they use for agriculture. The farming of the Mekong Delta land accounts for 24% of that country's gross domestic product and the majority of its food. The third hotspot, though smaller by population, is Central America and Mexico, and this is where I focus the bulk of my own research. I arrived in El Salvador in May 2019, and over the next several months and several trips, I traveled north into Guatemala, across the border into Mexico, and I traced typical migration routes all the way up to the US border and into the city of El Paso, Texas. In textbooks and reports, researchers describe a clear mechanism for how large numbers of people move. They have computer models that simulate it mathematically in great detail. But I wanted to understand how people make that difficult decision to leave their homes and who exactly should be counted as a climate migrant. About a week into my first trip into the region, I headed into the heart of Guatemala to a department called Alta Verapaz. Alta Verapaz is an extremely vulnerable place. It's comprised of a large remote blade of land reaching down from the mountain ridges of the center of the country all the way down to the flat fields of the Gulf of Mexico. It's one of Guatemala's poorest states and with about 1.2 million people among its most populous outside of Guatemala City. The people here are mostly indigenous Mayan, and 90% live in moderate to extreme poverty. They farm as their main source of income and subsistence, and hunger is increasingly common as conditions become more difficult. 80% of the population cannot always access sufficient food, and almost 1 out of 2 children show signs of malnutrition and stunted growth. In 2018, a starvation alert group affiliated with the U.S. Agency for International Development ranked Alta Verapaz alongside Somalia as one of the most urgent famine risk regions on the planet. The United Nations warns that temperatures here are rising faster than average, and water resources are diminishing quicker. The swings between extremes and the intensity of storms are growing more pronounced than elsewhere in the world. And for much of the 5 years prior to my arrival, the dry corridor mountains, the hills of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua had seen virtually no summer precipitation at all. Future projections are worse. Maize production in this part of Guatemala is forecast by the United Nations to decrease by 14% by 2050. Rice yields by 2070 could drop by a third. This is because areas of Guatemala that are now considered only semi-arid, including Alta Verapaz, will soon be more akin to desert. Rainfall in arid parts of the country is expected to decrease by 60%, and groundwater recharge will drop by more than 83%, according to researchers who contributed to the UN's climate assessment. I arrived in a village called Panzos, a loose grouping of wooden huts and primitive one-room houses with dirt floors and bright light shining between the boards. Children sat around with visibly bloated bellies. Jerry cans of drinking water and gasoline were scattered around doorways where chickens and pigs walked freely in and out. We stopped our truck beside a cluster of better constructed homes, buildings made from wooden boards nailed to a frame, looking for two men that we knew were part of a local farming cooperative here. Eva Hernandez greeted us in front of her house in an open space of beaten and compacted soil. The family lived in a single room, enclosed by rough-hewn lumber boards, capped by a rusted pallet of tin, nailed to the roof that trapped the burning tropical heat like an oven. Stones and small boulders protruded from the dirt floor, and against the wall, beside a full-size mattress, a wooden basin held an oily car battery that was jury-rigged to charge their cell phone. Beside it were a couple dozen cobs of dried corn, maize that the family crushed with water to make tortillas. Eva, and later her husband Jorge, told me a story of hope and one failed effort to grow food after another. Jorge was part of a third generation of his family to work this land. His father was a mine farmer, and he'd fought bloody battles to reclaim access to his ancestral fields from rich colonial landholders. They'd finally been allowed to lease it back on a rent-to-own basis. Jorge planted maize and beans on a flat section of silty soil that lay about a mile from the fast-moving currents of the Cahabon River, which runs down into the Gulf of Mexico. His crops were mostly for food, but he sold extras for money to buy sugar and for bus fare to send his children to the government school. Though his field wasn't far from the river, they had no irrigation to pipe and pump and distribute that water, and so they relied on the rain. And in 2014, the spring rains failed to arrive. Meteorologists blamed it on the El Nino cycle, when the trade winds over the Pacific switch directions and pull moisture away from the American coasts. El Nino used to happen once or twice in a decade here, but it happened again in 2016 and again in 2017. In 2018, it finally did rain, but the timing was off. In the spring, Jorge's seedlings were first scorched in the arid heat and then drowned in the dousing downpours. That fall, Jorge gambled his last seeds on a second crop, which finally grew fruitfully. Then an unexpected flood came. Jorge and his 7-year-old son waded chest deep into the waters, searching in vain for a few surviving juvenile cobs that they could still pluck and eat. What had first seemed like bad luck for Jorge and his family was fast becoming a matter of life or death. His children, malnourished, had not grown tall or gained weight in more than a year. His options were limited. He'd already mortgaged his land for more seeds. The big corporate farms weren't hiring because of the drought. Men like him were getting robbed and killed even when they took dangerous jobs in Guatemala City. The farm co-op pleaded with Guatemalan agriculture officials for emergency aid, just a few $1,000s to install irrigation, but they were ignored. And so Jorge pawned his last few assets, the motorbike, his father's animals among them, and he paid a guide or a coyote to help him travel to the United States. One night, just 2 weeks before I arrived there, he gathered around the hut that I sat in with his entire extended family. They shed tears, they traded hugs, The Mayan people were not accustomed to migrating for work as other parts of people in other parts of Guatemala were. And Jorge packed his and his son's belongings in a small plastic shopping bag, and just before midnight, they left. I want to dwell here for a moment and underscore how excruciating and heartbreaking a decision this was for Jorge and for his family to make. I had expected to find something much more pragmatic, a neat list of pros and cons and an opportunistic decision about the prospective opportunities that people thought that they might find in America. Instead, it was, by all accounts, a last resort, an attempt at mere survival. I heard similar stories up and down Central America, fathers torn from their children, leaving land that they'd been attached to their entire lives, marriages slipping apart over late night phone calls on disposable cell phones, while migrants face terrifying unknowns of big American cities like Houston or Los Angeles. Their migration was not pragmatic. It was an act of desperation. They had done everything in their power to stay. By the time Jorge and his son left, or the others, they had no choice. For others, the thing that ultimately forces them to leave may be several steps removed from dying crops or paralyzing heat, and yet they are collateral damage just the same. And it raises questions about what defines a climate migrant. I met a woman in San Salvador named Elvira de Jesus Cortez. Elvira was 22 when I met her, and she was working a job in the city cooking pupusas in a street side stand, making about $7 a day. Her money went to buy rent and to pay rent and to buy baby formula, and she eats at work. When we met, she told me that she has to leave San Salvador. She plans to find housekeeping work in Texas, but that will mean finding someone to care for her baby daughter. When American officials describe the reasons that Central American migrants are coming to the US border, they point to gang violence and conflict as the leading driver forcing people to move. And around the world, conflict, war, and violence remain the largest factors affecting human migration. But the story is not always so simple. Elvira's husband was murdered by gangs in a small town in the mountains of El Salvador near the Guatemalan border, and that's what forced her to move to San Salvador with her infant. Now street gangs force her to pay protection money there, taking her meager wages. So yes, Elvira is a victim of violence, and she may be driven out by that violence. But before she was a victim of violence, she was a victim of environmental change. She moved away from the village that she grew up in after a climate-driven fungus wiped out half of El Salvador's coffee crop. She says she'd go back to that village today instead of leaving her daughter and emigrating to the United States, except for the drought. Her family remains in that village, and they're among the 44% of Salvadorans that the United Nations says often lacks a steady or reliable source of food. So if Elvira leaves El Salvador, will she be a refugee fleeing violence or a climate migrant? Increasingly, the difference is blurring. Americans will not escape the impacts of mass migration either. And just as in El Salvador, when Americans begin to move, the reasons will not be clear. Environmental pressures here will mix with economic change. They'll mix with difficulties profiting from farming, the rising costs of energy for air conditioning, changes in insurance, new job opportunities, or better housing elsewhere, and so on. And this is what I've spent the last couple of years examining, trying to understand what the unfolding change will look like in the United States and what it will mean for American life. My reporting in the US began with an effort to gather the best available empirical data on the threats unfolding and to map them. What I wanted to do was see where they would overlap and visualize geographically the multiple perils and specific forecasts down to the county level for the country. And I also went back to that climate niche idea, the shifting of global livability, to understand where North America fits on that map and what it can tell us about where we lie in relation to the most productive climates of the future. The resulting maps, they tell a story of a country, the United States, with the walls closing in around it, with crop failures and paralyzing humidity piercing it right up through the middle. With water scarcity becoming nearly ubiquitous, pretty much the entire southern third of the country slips into marginal zones of that climate niche or begins to fall outside of it. Some of the changes are obvious. Wildfires encroach from the west, and sea levels eat away at the coasts. In the upper left-hand side is a map of major catastrophic wildfires. Heat radiates from the south of the country, but wildfires become prevalent across the southeast too, and in Florida, for example, as well as in South Carolina and in places like Georgia. So does drought, which spreads from the drying Ogallala Aquifer to the Mississippi Sands Aquifer to the rivers through the southeast. Sea level rise will snake inland, up river systems, flooding as far as 150 miles inland in places like Vicksburg, Mississippi. For the past several hundred years, the climatic sweet spot has more or less straddled this country, stretching from Appalachia to the Rockies. It's why our southeast is verdant and why our plains and Midwest produce $35 billion a year worth of crops and produce much of the grain to feed the world. But within the next 5 decades, that sweet spot shifts sharply northward. Under moderate emissions, now a best case scenario, it hovers over the northern Midwest and Chicago. Under a scenario of sharp warming, it moves all the way to the southern border of Canada and eventually to the other side of it. And you can see that here in that darker green highlighted space. Forecasts for the number of people who might move can't be taken as precise. They should be seen as a general guide. But the research that I've done in the United States and the researchers that I've talked to suggests that as many as 160 million Americans, or nearly half of us, would be pushed outside of the climate niche, and that as many as 13 million Americans will be displaced by coastal flooding alone. As this happens, crop yields in the heartland of the United States are forecast to drop between 30 and 90%. And you can see that here in the dark purple in the southernmost parts of Texas are the 90% reductions. Household energy costs in the South rise around 10% relative to their local economies and relative to heating costs in the North. Mortality rates begin to increase. Crime rises in the North as population grows. Nationally, economists estimate that all of this will cost the United States about 1.2% of its GDP for every degree of Celsius warming from here on out. But at the county level, in the areas hardest hit, in some parts of Florida and Louisiana, those economic damages will range from between 8 to 60% of GDP. You can see here the darkest shaded counties are those with the greatest impact to their economies. So the next question is, what does this look like for American society? Just as they do in other countries, the impacts will fall unequally and along the same dividing lines that already divide our society. They'll divide rich and poor along racial lines and between rural and urban areas, and they will exacerbate and underscore the inequalities created by redlining, by discriminatory development and investment, by unequal mortgage rates and interest rates. Communities that haven't received adequate investment in the past will fall more quickly behind in the future. Infrastructure will be stressed as never before. And obviously, again, not everyone facing these impacts will move. Mobility is a function of wealth and age and energy and opportunity. And so some people will stay by choice or they'll be trapped. And the risk is that some of the places where they remain in the most climate vulnerable areas will face a spiral of economic decline. In the US, this might look like collapsing tax bases that lead to worse infrastructure, that lead to still higher climate risks, poorer schools, fewer jobs, lower home values, and people lose their assets, and so more people leave. And that cycle perpetuates. And it will be the poor and the elderly especially who will be left behind. So one huge set of challenges in the United States is around how policymakers, leaders, and companies support those shrinking communities and adjust to create future possibilities. How do we plan for and facilitate anti-growth? How do we diversify economies so they're not disproportionately dependent on the highest risk sectors? And then, what are the opportunities, the places people will go, the growth that can result from it, the investments that will be safest in the future and contribute the most? The models and data I look at suggest that the population will shift towards the relative safe havens in the Northeast and the Great Lakes, and to a lesser degree in the Pacific Northwest, where there's ample water and the absence of threats like wildfires and hurricanes and coastal flooding. and where there is, in many cases, also ample infrastructure. Cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Buffalo, they have abundant housing. They have systems built for populations larger than those that live there today. And the data says that these broader regions may see improvements. They might see an increase in crop yields and longer growing seasons, while they decrease in other parts of the country. The Northeast might see steady economies or even an increase in GDP, a relative reduction in their energy costs, and increases in labor productivity. And so a large part of my focus in this recent book project is on how to navigate that transformation. Where do you find opportunity, the importance of transit and housing and schools, and how do you manage that growth? The fact is, many countries in the North both stand to benefit in some ways as the climate warms, just as the United States in the northern US may prosper. And because many of these countries also have low birth rates, they will need more people, perhaps immigrants, to seize on that opportunity. I looked at this dynamic in Russia, which is one example of potential strategic winner. An influential Stanford University study estimated that Russia could see more than 400% per capita growth in its GDP as the climate warms. In Russia, Russia has land, but it needs people. And with warming, more of its frozen land is becoming more habitable and more useful. So it's capitalizing on this opportunity, growing more grain. In the Russian Far East, where that change is happening fastest, the region has another dynamic. It sits north of the second most populous country in the world, China. Unsurprisingly, Chinese migrants are already spreading northward as thawing permafrost opens new farmland and Chinese see new opportunities for growth there. It's not inconceivable to imagine a future where China's huge population begins to spread northward onto a thawing tundra. Elsewhere around the world, the North will also do well. Canada could see per capita growth rise by 230% due to climate change, but it also needs people. The private sector in Canada is pushing what it calls the quote century initiative, and it's welcoming more migrants to grow the population from 32 million to 100 million people by later this century. It's a recognition that human capital can drive economic prosperity. And that brings me to these closing thoughts. Everything we're talking about today suggests that climate-driven migration could easily eclipse even the largest estimates as enormous segments of the Earth's population seek safe havens. And as it does, we risk seeing further division, the hardening of borders, and conflict. I saw this in Mexico, where thousands of Central Americans were pouring across the southern Mexico border. That was this slide that I had out of order. At first, Mexico greeted its migrants with open arms, and its president expressed unconditional support. But as the months wore on, the Mexican public lost patience and empathy. The Mexican authorities began to crack down harshly. Around the world, we're going to have to choose whether to wall off borders or facilitate migration. Hungary has fenced off its border with Serbia, part of nearly 1,000 kilometers of border walls surrounding EU states. India is completing a wall along its 2,500-mile-long border with Bangladesh. And even in the US, this is what we're doing, building walls, keeping people out. This slide shows the US-Mexican border at the top and Lithuania-Belarus on the right. And even within the United States, these tensions are emerging. The city of Lafayette, Louisiana rejected its displaced neighbors from 2 parishes south in the wake of Hurricane Laura in 2020. And Chico, California saw a rise in crime, 25% increase, and began rejecting newcomers after 18,000 people were displaced by wildfire next door in the town of Paradise in 2018. As part of my research with ProPublica and with the New York Times, we worked with those same demographers who worked with the World Bank to conduct our own analysis of climate migration in Central America. And the models suggest that the US border could see 30 million additional climate-driven migrants over the next several decades. But more importantly, they also suggest that policy differences globally lead to starkly different outcomes in what we're talking about today. Using several socioeconomic scenarios that the UN now uses to understand the intersection between policy choices and climate emissions, we can see that a future in which emissions are slowed and geopolitics remain open where trade is robust, controlled immigration is welcomed, leads to more migrants coming to the US, but it also leads to lower populations and less poverty and suffering overall, including in Guatemala. It suggests that greater global economic and geopolitical stability. A more hostile future, in which nations retreat behind walls, pursue more nationalistic policies, and are slower to reduce emissions, leads to faster population growth globally, a deeper poverty, and increased famine. It ultimately suggests vastly larger numbers of migrants against the border. So we have choices. The same data that suggests that 1/3 of humanity could soon be excluded from the climate niche also makes a moral case for immediate and aggressive policies to slow the rate of warming and to lower the number of people globally destined for greater suffering. For every 1/10 of a degree of additional warming, the climate niche research suggests that 140 million more people will be pushed outside of the niche. The inverse is also true. Slowing global emissions would dramatically reduce the number of people displaced or grappling with conditions outside of the niche. If warming were limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, half as many people would be left outside of that optimal zone. If global emissions are held back, for instance, in Nigeria, the number of people displaced from the climate niche would drop from 300 million to 40 million. The global population suffering from extreme heat would reduce fivefold from 22% of the planet to just 5%. It has to be noted that the West bears a special responsibility for this situation. Throughout the world, the climate niche researchers estimate the average person who's going to be exposed to unprecedented heat comes from a place that emitted less than half of the per capita emissions of those wealthy countries, and 1/5 that of Americans. American per capita emissions are more than twice those of Europeans, who still live a prosperous and modern existence. So there appears to be ample room for change without substantial sacrifice. Each American today emits nearly enough emissions over their lifetime to push one Indian or Nigerian of the future outside of their climate niche, the study found. And so this is the thought that I want to leave you with today, which is what we do next matters. Regardless of policy differences on how we get there, we should now see clearly the stakes. We should see that the steps to addressing them are explicit and they are doable, and they rely on technology that already exists. It is just work. And so we need to keep going, put one foot in front of the other, and do it as quickly as possible. Reducing consumption, for example, doesn't mean having to lower our standard of living. It might just mean lessening our waste and our inefficiencies. And achieving that would not only slow the rate of warming, but reduce the number of people elsewhere who will suffer the consequences tomorrow. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answering your questions if we still have any time for that.